Well, we continue in 1 Samuel, and it's this part of the book, as with the book itself, is the whole story of, fascinating story. And now this is where Samuel the prophet comes along. Now, Samuel becomes, I suppose I'm giving a little of this away, but Samuel becomes the prophet of Saul. Saul is the first king of Israel. So I think I mentioned yesterday that Samuel becomes kind of like, I don't want to put this in the wrong way because I don't want to compare incorrectly, and it is a bit of an incorrect comparison, but he becomes kind of like a John the Baptist character in the fact that he is the last prophet before Israel has a king, and the first prophet of the king. Just like St. John the Baptist is the last prophet of the Old Testament and the first prophet in the Gospels. So we see that. And this is who Samuel is. Now, what we're looking at today is, again, Hannah is praying to the Lord, but this time Eli sees her. And remember, Eli is a good priest. Every time Eli's name comes up, I think of that great song by, I believe it's Three Dog Night, Eli's Coming, which I'll probably play after I record this, but no relation whatsoever between the two. But Eli is the high priest at the time, and he sees Hannah praying, and as the story goes, as you read the story, you'll see he thinks she's drunk, because she's moving her lips and she's praying, but he can't hear what she's saying. Oh, no, she's drunk. And I suppose part of that is also that a male-female thing. Oh, she's just a woman type idea, which obviously is something that it has no place in our society, but back then they would look at it that way. However, he sees something, and he tells her, go home, you drunken woman. And she says, no, I'm begging something for the Lord. And he doesn't know what it is yet, but Eli says, may the Lord grant you your request. So we have all of this powerful stuff going on. And with that, we see that Hannah goes home. Her husband, Elkanah, who, remember, is also married to Peninnah, who does have children. So her husband, Elkanah, has relations with her, and there we go. We continue from there. And we're going to look at this, what happens from there. And as we look at it, we see that this is, again, this powerful story of someone who cannot have children and then is granted the blessing by the Lord and has children. And we saw a bit of this in the time of Advent, again, pushing towards Mary. Now, as I said yesterday, I mistakenly described what happened with Hannah as being the mother of Samson because it's a similar story. And I got the two mixed up, but actually this is the mother of Samuel. So she conceives, so that must have been a powerful story as it was. And at the end, as it says, after 9 months, she gave birth to Samuel. Samuel, which we will see tomorrow, grows up a very dedicated prophet. And so he has the powers of a prophet. Now, she actually dedicated him to the Lord. So now we're going to see what happens with that. And so tomorrow we're going to see the calling of Samuel. And this is this powerful message. And Samuel becomes this powerful prophet, which we will see as we progress through the book of Samuel. And he becomes, as I said, the first prophet of the kingship. So we're going to see him be the prophet to Saul. We'll also see him be kind of the prophet to David, but we'll see as that goes along. So this is a powerful story, but remember behind this, and this is something powerful to look at, is Eli, whose two sons are the most corrupt people in the Old Testament, I think. Oh, if they're not, they're really up there because their corruption is even greater because they are priests and they act as corrupt priests. Now, something that's very important. I was talking to someone the other day, and one of the things they brought up is that whole idea of not questioning the priest. I forget what the context was, but my response is people believed that you should never question the priest. And I said, never, with capital letters, never teach that to your children. Well, we can see that lesson right here, which we'll talk about on Thursday, that lesson right here. Eli's sons were also priests. Eli was a good man. His sons were absolutely crooked. I mean, basically, as I said, if Jezebel was the most evil woman in the Bible, the two sons, I don't know if they were the most evil men in the Bible, but they're clearly up there if they aren't. And so we see that. And therefore, you take that lesson. You also see something similar in Daniel. You take that lesson and you realize never, ever tell someone that you should never question a priest. You should never argue with a priest. You should never say, would you contradict a priest? No, don't do that at all. Now, that doesn't mean that you turn around and say, I don't care what the priest says because he's speaking for the church, but I don't listen to the church. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, this is one of the issues that I like to bring up. Almost nobody has come to me in a long, long time and questioned my homilies. And that's okay. That's fine. But, if someone says something that I disagree with, that I welcome that response. But almost no one does that. Yet I listen to people who will complain about something that a priest said. I just heard something over at the Uncharted Catholic Man Discord, where this parishioner was explaining from this parish. I have no idea where the parish is, and the priest took this time to talk about the Holy Family and the holiness of Joseph and Mary, to talk about the worst sin, which is contraception. I have no idea how you put those two things together. Now, first of all, and I wouldn't necessarily say that's the worst sin. As a matter of fact, well, I'll just leave it at that. And that's what he did. And this guy who's, or I don't know if it's male or female, who is explaining this is what happened, is saying, how do you do that? This is what he did. And that is a legitimate complaint, but it's a legitimate complaint to be brought to the person who was preaching, whether it's a priest or a deacon. I have a parishioner. I had a parishioner over at Alston, and anything he disagreed with my homily, he would send nasty emails to me. He still does. Even though it has nothing to do with the homily, if he disagrees with me. As much as I didn't like his emails, and I didn't, I would rather see that than someone saying, well, this is what Father Carr says, so we have to do exactly what he says. If you disagree with the priest, that's important for you to tell the priest or the deacon, because he needs to know, because maybe what it means is he's explained something the wrong way, or maybe what it means is his message isn't correct, or whatever the case may be. These are important things to do, so always bring that up. I used to have a parishioner in my first parish, which I absolutely disagree with this, but she would scream at you if you gave a homily that she didn't like. And that's going too far. That's not allowed, because that's being disrespectful. It's not disagreeing with the homily. It's being disrespectful in your disagreement. But we can take the lesson that we're going to see more on Thursday, that here you have a good man who is Eli, who is the high priest, and he has these two absolutely corrupt sons. And I'm going to explain to you on Thursday just how corrupt they were, because that's a fascinating story also in 1 Samuel. So we're seeing this, but we also recognize that the Lord, this is well known, and we're seeing this happening here in this story, the Lord raises up prophets during difficult times. And you understand, and one of the problems we have in the Bible, I don't know if there's a name for this, but you have the stories in the Bible, and the Bible is a big book, but you have all the stories, and it seems like this is the way people lived in biblical times all the time. No, it wasn't. There were centuries where nothing happened, where there weren't great prophets who were raised up. As a matter of fact, if you look at some of the stories, you have the stories of the judges, of which we're really coming to the end of that. But you had the stories of the judges, but the great prophets you see, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, come long after this period. They come long after this period. They're all around 500 BC. You have Elijah, who's really around 800 BC. And so there's all this space in between. If you take Elijah, who was in the northern kingdom, if you take him at somewhere in the vicinity of the 8th century BC, and then you go to Jeremiah and Ezekiel, well, they're in the 6th century BC. There's 200 years between them. So a lot has happened, but you don't have this whole thing where people in the biblical times always had miracles happening and everything else. No, that's not true. But you also see that, you have people, they were all good people. No, they weren't. There's the great story of Daniel, in the book of Daniel and Susanna. Now, granted, that story, which takes place, when does that? It takes place during the Babylonian exile, but it's actually written after, somewhere in the vicinity of the Maccabees, or after the Babylonian exile. Long after. So we see that for fame. But what is the story of Daniel about? It's about these corrupt elders. So we have to understand that that's a reality. So never get into your mind that you cannot contradict or you cannot question the priest. You should question the priest, at least as a way of learning, and maybe you need something to listen to the priest, but also be ready to give your argument back, because that's how people learn. And when I go back to this on this Holy Family Sunday, the most important thing they learned was the sinfulness of contraception. I don't see how that adds up. And I'm going to disagree with it. Now, I'm sure the homily all work together and stuff, but I really have a problem with priests who are always teaching on sin. And one of the reasons is because, again, you can be an atheist and follow Catholic teaching. You may not agree with it, but you can be an atheist and follow Catholic teaching. So you'll find most of my homilies, if you've ever been to the masses I do, most of my homilies are built on how we live mission. And the reason why we want to turn from sin is because it interrupts with our mission. We're not as effective as missionaries if we are focused on sin. And one of the sayings I always keep in mind, which is a great saying to think of, especially when you're preparing to go to confession, is where your treasure is, there your heart is also. So if your treasure is not in spreading the gospel, and you can have another treasure as well, not instead, as well. I mean, you can be focused on the gospel, but you can also be focused on how much you love doing your job, or how much you love being a good craftsperson, or craftsman or woman, or how you love, being a parent, or how you love whatever you do, being a CEO, whatever the case may be. That's fine, but you don't want to reject the gospel in place of what you treasure. You see what I'm saying there? So you can have other things that you love too, but you want to love God more. But then we go back to that whole saying, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. So if you find yourself focused on something sinful, that's where your heart is. But if you find yourself struggling against sin, that's a whole different ballgame, because what you're doing is you're seeking a greater good, and you may have maybe a habit or a struggle with temptation or sin, but you know there is a greater good out there, as opposed to making the whatever it is that is so sinful your greater good. You see what I'm saying? But I really have issues with priests who only preach on sin, because are they leading us to understand mission, or are they getting us led into fearing that we're going to end up in hell, which is a very bad message. We'll be back right after this. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Did you know that the Catholic Audio Media Podcast is available on various podcast platforms? You can find us, among others, on Podbean, which is our home platform. You can find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeart, among others. Just look for Catholic Audio Media, all one word. On some platforms, such as Spotify, look for Catholic Audio Media, 3 words, and subscribe and listen to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out. Patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back. And again, going to current events, as we're watching this story, in the Bible, but we're also looking at the current events going on behind the scenes. And I see, as I'm recording this, which is Sunday afternoon, not too far in the future, we're seeing that there is a prediction that Iran may fall within the week. As a matter of fact, I was listening. As you know, one of my favorite radio stations is WABC out of New York. I check it out through the app, but also on nights, I can hear it on my car radio as I'm driving, especially if the sun is down, if I'm driving around at night. And I can hear it sometimes clear as a bell. I think I had mentioned to you one time I was listening, and I'm tuning on the radio, and I hear this radio station that I thought was coming in so clear. I thought it was a radio station in Boston. I'm saying, wow, this is really clear. This must be a new station. Turns out it was KDKA Pittsburgh. Wow. And so what happens is that this is an AM skip. Well, but WABC comes to us all the way from New York, which isn't that far. And it's 50,000 watts. So we're going to listen to it, just like I'm sure they can hear WBZ in New York. But in any case, so I'm listening to, through the app, the Larry Kudlow show, who comes in on Saturday afternoons. And they were talking about, he was talking with Steve Forbes. And they were saying they don't see that the Iranian regime is going to last the week. We'll see what happens. But one of the fascinating things that I'm taking from this is, remember, I was in the Navy when Iran fell the first time, and that's when the Shah went into exile. At the time, the Shah, I think he was rather young, if I'm not wrong. Maybe in his 20s. I could be wrong about that, but that would make sense because this was 50 years ago, you got to remember. So, almost 50 years ago. Well, the Shah obviously died, but his son is still alive, and he's behind a lot of this resistance. And it sounds a lot like an exact reversal of what happened in Iran the first time. But Steve Forbes was on with Larry Kudlow. And I've been listening to Larry Kudlow for years. And in between all that time, he was the economist for the first Trump administration. But I've been listening. And I don't have two sticks to rub together, but I like listening to what he has to say. I've always loved listening to Larry Kudlow. Well, in any case, he brings out Steve Forbes from Forbes magazine. He brought out, and I didn't realize this, inflation changes regimes when it gets really severe. And I guess it's very severe right now in Iran. And they brought up the inflation was so bad during the last days of the Tsar. That's what helped cause the end of the Tsarist regime in Russia. And then, of course, communism rose after that. And then, of course, they brought up the Weimar Republic, which brought the end of the Weimar Republic in Germany and brought up Nazism. So those are not two great examples. But at the same time, that's what they were saying when inflation's really bad. And I guess inflation is really bad right now in Iran. Well, obviously, I'm watching this with interest because I was there when Iran fell the first time. And once it fell, remember, when Iran fell, what was first of all, you had the Iranian hostages, and they were hostages right up until, so this was 1979, now as I remember. I was in the Philippines at the time. Our ship was in the Philippines, and we were on a destroyer tender. So all around us were all the different ships that were in port in Subic Bay, and they were all different, frigates and FFGs, which are FFG means, I guess, guns, but FFG means they're guided missile frigates. You had FFs, which was the ship that I eventually would go to, fast frigates, which were the old destroyer escorts. And then you also had aircraft carriers and the amphib stuff and the whole bit. And there was also the Naval Air Station, Subic Bay, and I'll explain why that's important. And we got the orders, 12 hours. Everything that we had to fix on our ship had to be fixed and over on the ships that we were repairing them for in 12 hours, because every one of those ships was going to the Middle East. And we were the only ones that weren't, which was interesting in itself. And there it happened. We got all this stuff, and then we watched all the ships go, and they were all going to, the Persian Gulf. Well, one of the things that also happened, I don't know if I've explained this to you before, but you may or may not remember this, or you may not have heard this when you weren't listening to the podcast. When an aircraft carrier goes out, the planes do not go with it. They land, they fly out the next day, and they land the following day. So the planes are not on the aircraft carrier when it's in port. They're at a naval air station. So the following day I had watch, and there I was standing on the ship, and it was like we were treated to an air show, because what happens is the planes, all the jets go out the next day. So there we were, treated to this air show as they flew off of the Naval Air Station, Subic Bay, and then went out to the respective aircraft carriers that were heading out there. And I remember before they pulled out, ABC, I suppose they all were there, but ABC had a reporter there. He was probably a local guy who was, he was American, but he was probably an American guy who was stationed in the Philippines. And they had a reporter there right outside the ship, standing there talking about how all these ships are heading out to sea. And I'm like, wow, we could have seen ABC from home here. But in any case, they went out. And that was the beginning of the Iranian hostage crisis, which lasted for 44 some odd days, right up until just after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. And then they were all freed. That was a horrible story in itself, just a very terrible story. And that's what they said, one of the reasons why Carter was not reelected is because every night on CBS, and I think it was, if I'm not wrong, it was Dan Rather, they would say how many days these guys had been hostages in Iran. Horrible story. It's a terrible story. So eventually they were released after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. Literally, I think it was 10 minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, they were all released. But we have been in the Persian Gulf since then. Now, prior to the fall of Iran, the United States and the Iranians were allies. And in fact, when I went to my original A school, which is where I first learned sonar, I was a sonar technician in our A school, they had Iranians there, and they were all there learning sonar. And once Iran fell, they were gone, and the Saudis came in, and the Saudis have been there ever since. I don't think Naval Training Center San Diego still exists, but that's where it was, and the Saudis came in after that. But they were gone. They were gone overnight, the Iranians, and so we've been following that Iranian revolution since then. And let's face it, what replaced the Shah of Iran was horrible. And one of the interesting things, when I was in college, before I joined the Navy, I was at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. That's also where I worked at WMB AM, just, volunteered actually. But it was I did a lot for them. It was great. That place has released a lot of famous people in radio. But in any case, I remember that they would have these great protest people marching down the street. And there was one of these guys used to protest everything. You always see them, and there he was marching like this, whatever, in a way to bring down the Shah. And I remember him march because he's one of these people who protested everything over at UMass. And there he was. And then when the Shah fell, and when we saw what replaced it, I'm like, I hope this guy realizes what a huge mistake that was. Now, you have to realize the Shah ran Iran with an iron fist, just like Saddam Hussein did. And they can easily be made villains, but if you talk to people in their countries, they'll say they weren't villains. You talk to people in Africa, they don't like what the United States did to Muammar Gaddafi, because they'll say, you learned he was a villain. He did more for his people than you ever imagined. But you Americans thought he was a villain, and so you tossed him out. But the Libyans loved him, and Libya's been a mess ever since, and that's why we get a bad name. And it's what the Shah was doing so strongly was why we got a bad name among the Iranians. But what replaced them was 1,000 times worse. We're going to talk more on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. You can now leave a message for us, which we can air and discuss on this program. Just call 617-297-7452. That's 617-297-7452. 617-297-7452. Feel free to call, leave a comment, a question, or even feedback, and we may play it on the air. I can discuss your comment or question as well, so give that a try. 617-297-7452, 617-297-7452. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back, and so we're looking at this powerful story of what is going on in Iran. So we're kind of watching this, and maybe next week I may be talking about a new Iran, and the Shah's son could be the Shah position of the Shah returns, because Shah Reza Pahlavi was his name, and I think this one is Reza Pahlavi 2 or 3 or 4 or something like that. But again, I don't think he was in his 20s when Iran fell. So you add 50 to, so he'd probably be in the 60s today. Fascinating. And he's waiting to come back. Now, the Ayatollah came back from France. When Iran fell in 1979, the Ayatollah came back from France, and there you go. You had him coming in, and then you saw this absolute disaster of regime that has been there since 1979, and it's a disaster of regime. There are more Iranians outside of Iran than there are in Iran, and I remember when I was in Los Angeles during that time. We got back in port. And you'd ask someone, like we were in an Italian restaurant, and the person kind of looked Italian, but we weren't sure, and the accent wasn't Italian, so we asked her where she was from. She said Persia, because she wasn't going to say Iran. Los Angeles has a lot of Iranians. And it's in this point, one of the things you realize is that old saying, Iran is a good place to be from, because there were so many Iranians outside of that country because of all this. We'll be back tomorrow. Have a blessed day. The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.